When I first bought my home, I thought I had found peace. After years of renting cramped apartments and dealing with loud neighbors, I finally had a place of my own. It wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. A modest, single-family house in a suburban neighborhood with a front yard I could take pride in and a backyard big enough to relax in. For the first time in my life, I felt settled. I had no idea that my biggest headaches were not going to come from loud tenants or broken plumbing, but from the very people who claimed to protect the neighborhood. The Homeowners Association. It started one quiet morning when I stepped outside to grab the mail. Taped to my front door was a bright yellow notice. At first glance, I thought it was a delivery slip, but as soon as I read the bold letters, my stomach dropped. It was a violation. Notice from the HOA. According to them, my front yard was not in compliance with community standards. They claimed there were weeds in my lawn, that my grass was overgrown, and that I had failed to maintain the uniform aesthetic of the neighborhood. The fine, $200. At first, I laughed. My lawn was perfectly trimmed, the grass cut just 2 days before. I had even lined the edges with fresh mulch, planted flowers, and kept everything neat. In fact, my yard was one of the best kept on the entire street. The irony was that some of my neighbors had brown patches, dead plants, and scattered debris, yet they had no notices taped to their doors. Why me? I brushed it off as a mistake. Surely the board didn't mean it. Maybe they mixed up addresses. I decided to contact the HOA to clear things up, but the tone of their response was anything but apologetic. They insisted my yard was visibly non-compliant and threatened additional fines if I didn't remedy the issue immediately. They provided no photos, no evidence, just vague claims. Something didn't add up. Why was my yard suddenly a problem? I started walking the neighborhood, observing other houses, and what I found was infuriating. Many lawns were in far worse condition than mine. Overgrown bushes, weeds sprouting everywhere, broken fences left unrepaired. None of them had notices. That's when I realized this wasn't about weeds or aesthetics at all. This was personal. Someone on the board had decided to target me. As the days passed, more letters arrived, each one more aggressive, each one stacking fines onto my account. They claimed I owed $500, then $800. They even threatened to place a lien on my home if I didn't pay. The breaking point came when I received a final warning. It stated that unless I brought my lawn into compliance within 14 days, the HOA would hire their own contractor to fix it and bill me thousands of dollars for the service. I felt trapped. My perfectly manicured lawn had somehow become a weapon against me. That night, I sat in my living room staring at the stack of notices spread across the coffee table. Rage boiled inside me. They thought they could bully me into paying for something I didn't owe. They thought I would roll over and comply. But they underestimated one thing. I don't take kindly to being pushed around. So I decided to fight. I started by documenting everything. I took photos of my lawn every morning, time-stamped and dated. I kept every notice, every email, every letter. I even recorded phone calls with the HOA representatives, carefully saving them in a folder. But evidence was just the beginning. I knew I had to dig deeper. I began researching the HOA itself. How much power did they really have? What authority allowed them to fine me? And most importantly, were they following their own rules? What I discovered shocked me. Buried deep in the association's bylaws was a section on enforcement. It clearly stated that before issuing fines, the HOA was required to conduct a formal inspection and provide photographic evidence of violations. They were also required to offer an appeals process. None of that had happened. On top of that, I found meeting minutes from past board sessions. In one, a member openly complained about new homeowners ruining the look of the neighborhood. The timing lined up perfectly with when my fines began. It became obvious. This wasn't about weeds. It was about control, intimidation, and singling me out. The realization lit a fire inside me. If the HOA wanted a fight, I was ready to give them one. But I wasn't going to fight with angry words or late-night rants. I was going to fight with the very thing they never expected, the law. That night, I contacted a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes. I explained everything, from the bogus fines to the ignored bylaws. He listened carefully and then said something that gave me hope. You've got a strong case. They've broken their own rules. If we push this, they'll regret ever targeting you. For the first time since that yellow notice appeared on my door, I felt a sense of calm. The HOA thought they had the upper hand. They thought their threats would scare me into paying. But instead, They had poked the wrong bear, and now I was preparing to turn their petty fines into a full-blown legal nightmare. As I organized my evidence, I knew this was only the beginning. Because once you take on an HOA, the real fight doesn't start with the first notice. It starts the moment you decide you won't be intimidated, and I had just made that decision. The day after I spoke with the lawyer, I felt a strange sense of control return to me. For weeks, the HOA had made me feel cornered, but now I was armed with knowledge and professional backing. This wasn't just about a few fines anymore. This was about principle. It was about standing up against an organization that thought intimidation was the same thing as authority. My lawyer instructed me to start with something simple: demand proof. He drafted a formal letter on my behalf, citing the HOA's own bylaws and requesting photographic evidence of the supposed violations. We also demanded a record of the inspection that was required before any fine could be issued. The letter was sent via certified mail, making it impossible for them to pretend they hadn't received it. Days passed, and the silence from the HOA was deafening. No evidence, no photos, no inspection records. Instead, they doubled down. Another notice arrived, this time claiming my fines had now reached $200. They threatened legal action, stating they would pursue a lien on my home if I didn't pay. But here's the thing, their threats no longer scared me. Instead of panicking, I handed the new notice to my lawyer. He smirked and added it to the growing file of violations committed, not by me, but by the HOA. Each new letter they sent was another piece of evidence in my favor. Each misstep only strengthened my case, but the HOA wasn't done. One afternoon, as I was mowing my lawn, a board member pulled up in their car. They didn't speak, didn't wave, just sat there glaring at me, phone in hand, recording as if waiting for me to make a mistake. It was clear they were trying to intimidate me, hoping I would slip up and give them something to use. I ignored them and kept mowing, but inside I was seething. The pettiness of it all was staggering. These people weren't protecting the neighborhood. They weren't maintaining standards. They were bullying residents into submission, and I just happened to be the one who refused to bend. That night, I dug deeper. I attended an HOA meeting, sitting quietly in the back as the board members discussed budgets, landscaping contracts, and other homeowner complaints. I noticed something interesting. The same few names kept coming up. People who were fined, people who were threatened, people who eventually either paid up or moved out. A pattern was forming, one that suggested I wasn't the first target, just the latest. When it came time for the open forum, I raised my hand. Calmly, I asked the board about the process for issuing fines. I quoted their bylaws word for word, asking why certain steps weren't being followed. Their faces tightened. Their voices grew defensive. They danced around my questions, claiming inspections had been done but refusing to provide proof. It was then I realized they weren't just sloppy, they were reckless. They thought no one would ever call them out. After the meeting, a couple of neighbors approached me. They whispered that they had faced similar harassment. One had been fined for having a flower pot in the wrong color. Another was told their mailbox was not uniform and was threatened with penalties until they replaced it. The resentment was there, simmering just beneath the surface. But most people felt powerless to resist. That's when I knew I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for everyone who had been steamrolled by this board. With my lawyer's guidance, I filed a formal complaint. We weren't just disputing the fines. We were accusing the HOA of violating their own bylaws, abusing their authority, and engaging in discriminatory enforcement. Every notice, every threat, every attempt at intimidation became part of a growing case file. The HOA's response? Retaliation. Suddenly, new violation notices appeared on my door. They claimed my trash bins weren't stored correctly, that my backyard shed was unapproved, even that my garden hose was unsightly. Each claim was more absurd than the last. It was obvious they were trying to bury me in fines, hoping to overwhelm me until I caved. But instead of weakening my resolve, it only fueled me further. Each new violation was added to the stack of evidence. Each baseless claim was another nail in their coffin. Then came the breaking point. The HOA sent a contractor to my property without permission. I came home to find strangers on my lawn, measuring, inspecting, and taking photos. When I demanded to know what they were doing, they claimed they were documenting compliance. In reality, it was trespassing, another violation of their own rules. I called my lawyer immediately. His response was short and sharp. Good, that's exactly what we needed. We were no longer just defending my yard. We were building a case that could dismantle their entire operation. But as strong as my position was becoming legally, the stress was beginning to wear on me. Each day brought new letters, new threats, new glares from board members driving by slowly, as if to remind me I was under watch. The tension in the neighborhood grew thick. Some neighbors quietly supported me, while others avoided me, clearly afraid of being targeted next. One night, as I sat at my desk, surrounded by papers, I thought about the absurdity of it all. All of this chaos, all of this conflict, all of this hostility over a yard that was perfectly maintained. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about rules. It was about power. The HOA wasn't enforcing standards. They were enforcing control. And the moment I refused to bow, they declared war. But they had underestimated me, because unlike others, I wasn't going to move, and I wasn't going to pay. I was going to fight. And as I prepared the next wave of legal action with my lawyer, I realized the HOA was walking straight into a trap of their own making. The legal nightmare I was preparing for them was about to begin. By the time we filed the lawsuit, I was no longer just a frustrated homeowner. I was a man on a mission. The HOA had spent weeks piling fines and threats on me, thinking they could break me down. Instead, they had armed me with enough evidence to turn the tables completely. My lawyer prepared a comprehensive complaint. It outlined every violation of their bylaws, every instance of selective enforcement, every notice that lacked documentation. We even included the incident where their contractor trespassed on my property without consent. The case wasn't just about one homeowner versus the HOA. It painted a picture of an organization abusing its power systematically. When the HOA board received notice of the lawsuit, their confidence began to crack. At first, they blustered, sending yet another threatening letter claiming they would pursue full reimbursement of all legal fees. But this time, their words felt hollow. They weren't prepared for an actual fight in court. Behind the scenes, I heard whispers from neighbors. The board had called an emergency meeting, panicked about the lawsuit. Some members were furious, blaming each other for letting things go too far. Others feared the potential costs if they lost. And all of it made its way back to me, because not everyone in the neighborhood supported their heavy-handed tactics. Still, the board tried to put on a brave face. They continued issuing me violation notices as if nothing had changed. They sent out newsletters claiming they were protecting community standards and fending off frivolous challenges. But anyone who looked closely could see the cracks forming. Meanwhile, my case was building momentum. My lawyer filed for discovery, which meant the HOA was legally required to hand over documents related to their enforcement practices. What came back was astonishing. There were no inspection records for my supposed violations, no photographs of my lawn, no documentation showing fines were applied fairly across all homeowners. Instead, the files revealed a pattern. The same small group of residents had been repeatedly fined, while others were ignored entirely. It was proof of selective enforcement, the very thing the bylaws explicitly prohibited. Worse, some board meeting minutes showed casual remarks that bordered on discriminatory. Comments about new homeowners not fitting in and certain people not respecting the community aesthetic revealed a bias that had nothing to do with grass or weeds. When my lawyer showed me the documents, I felt both vindicated and enraged. They had targeted me without reason, lied about their authority, and abused their power. And now, the evidence was undeniable. As the case gained traction, something unexpected happened. Other homeowners started reaching out. People who had been silent for months suddenly found their voice. They told me about fines for bird feeders, for welcome mats, even for children's toys left in the yard. One family had paid thousands just to avoid a lien on their home. Another said they had been too scared to fight back after receiving threats of foreclosure. My fight had become more than personal. It had become a rallying point. The HOA's iron grip on the community was loosening, but with support came new risks. The board realized I wasn't standing alone anymore, and they grew desperate. They began sending letters to the entire neighborhood, warning that my lawsuit could bankrupt the community and raise fees for everyone. It was a transparent attempt to turn neighbors against me. Some people did grow wary, questioning whether my fight was worth the cost. But others saw through the manipulation. They knew the truth. If the HOA won, It meant endless fines, unchecked power, and no accountability. If I won, it meant freedom from their abuse. The tension in the neighborhood became almost unbearable. Cars slowed down in front of my house more often. Board members avoided eye contact when passing me on the street. Rumors swirled at every corner. It felt less like a suburban community and more like a battleground. Then came the moment that shifted everything. At a preliminary court hearing, the HOA's lawyer was pressed by the judge to present evidence of my supposed violations. With no photos, no inspection records, and no consistent enforcement logs, their case crumbled under questioning. My lawyer calmly laid out the inconsistencies, citing the bylaws they had ignored. The judge's frustration was obvious, and though no ruling was made that day, it was clear the board was on shaky ground. When word spread about what had happened in court, the board's image took a massive hit. Homeowners who had once feared them now saw them for what they were: a group of bullies who had overstepped their authority. More neighbors began showing up to meetings, demanding transparency, demanding accountability. The HOA tried one last act of intimidation. They issued me a community lien warning, claiming they would move to seize my property if I didn't pay the fines. But by then, their threats were empty. My lawyer responded with a countersuit, adding charges of harassment, trespassing, and emotional distress. The legal nightmare I had promised them was now fully underway, and the walls were closing in. As I sat in my living room one evening, looking out over my perfectly manicured lawn, I realized just how far things had escalated. What began as a single notice taped to my door had snowballed into a full-scale war that could decide the future of the neighborhood. And the best part? I wasn't just surviving the storm. I was winning it. But I knew the final battle was still ahead. The court date was set, the evidence was ready, and soon the entire community would learn exactly what their HOA had been doing in the shadows. The board had underestimated me from the start. They thought they could bully me into silence. Instead, I was about to expose them in the harshest light possible. The nightmare they had created for me was about to become their downfall. The morning of the trial felt surreal. Months of tension, countless notices, endless threats. It had all led to this moment. I stood outside the courthouse in a suit that felt slightly too formal for me, clutching a folder stuffed with every photo, letter, and document I had collected since that first yellow notice appeared on my door. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was heavy. The HOA board members sat together at one table, their lawyer whispering hurriedly to them, faces grim and tight. On my side, it was just me and my attorney. Yet despite being outnumbered, I felt confident, because unlike them, I had the truth on my side. When proceedings began, the judge wasted no time. He demanded evidence, clarity, and documentation. The HOA's lawyer rose, insisting my lawn had been non-compliant and unsightly. He waived papers, but when pressed, he had no photos, no inspection logs, no proof that any rules had been applied fairly. My lawyer countered with precision. He presented the bylaws, pointing to the sections that required inspections and photographs. He laid out the timeline of fines, the lack of evidence, and the blatant disregard for process. Then, piece by piece, he revealed the documents obtained. In discovery, meeting minutes with discriminatory remarks, selective enforcement patterns, and records showing other homeowners were ignored for far worse violations. As each exhibit was entered into the record, I watched the judge's expression darken. The turning point came when my lawyer introduced testimony from neighbors. One after another, they stepped forward, recounting their own experiences of unfair fines and harassment. A mother described being fined for her child's toys left outside. An elderly couple spoke about being threatened over a flower pot. Their voices trembled, but their stories painted a damning picture. The HOA wasn't protecting the neighborhood. It was preying on it. When it was my turn to speak, I stood tall. I explained how my lawn had been perfectly maintained, how I had documented everything, and how I had been harassed for months over baseless accusations. I spoke not with anger, but with calm conviction, because by now the facts spoke louder than any rage ever could. The HOA's defense crumbled. Their lawyer stammered, trying to argue that they had discretion in enforcement. But the judge cut him off sharply, reminding him that discretion did not mean disregard for bylaws. And then came the ruling. The judge declared the HOA had violated their own bylaws, failed to provide due process, and engaged in selective enforcement. All fines against me were voided immediately. The attempted lien was thrown out, but it didn't stop there. The judge ordered the HOA to pay my legal fees, compensate me for harassment, and conduct a full audit of their enforcement practices. Across the community, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of the gavel striking. I had won. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Months of stress, of intimidation, of living under constant surveillance, it was finally over. But the victory wasn't just mine. It belonged to every neighbor who had ever been bullied, every homeowner who had ever felt powerless. The aftermath rippled through the neighborhood quickly. Word spread that the HOA had lost in court. Their reputation was shattered, their authority weakened. Homeowners who once feared them now stood taller, knowing the board could no longer act without accountability. Within weeks, change began. Several board members resigned under pressure, unable to withstand the backlash. New elections were held, and for the first time in years, homeowners who truly cared about the community, not about control, took seats at the table. The ridiculous fines stopped, the threats ceased, and slowly, the neighborhood transformed from a battleground back into what it should have been all along, a place to call home. As for me, I went back to enjoying my yard, the same yard that had sparked this entire nightmare. I planted new flowers, trimmed the hedges, and mowed the grass with a sense of quiet pride. Every time I looked at it, I was reminded of the fight I had endured and won. But more importantly, I was reminded of a lesson that went far beyond grass and bylaws. Power only lasts as long as people let it. The HOA had thrived on fear, but the moment someone stood up, their empire of intimidation collapsed. In the end, they had tried to fine me for my own yard, but what they really did was hand me the rope that unraveled their entire system. What began as a notice on my door ended as a legal nightmare for them, and I walked away. Not just with a victory, but with a neighborhood finally free from the grip of bullies who thought they could control us forever.